Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, your weekly source for horror gaming discussions and proudly part of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Cregger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week, we're going to chat about a franchise that we've never, not even once, chatted about for this podcast for our feature this week. That being our first look at Zach Cregger's crack at Resident Evil, a film franchise that Neil and I are fans of to vary, and I do mean very varying degrees, in the different directions that franchise has taken in terms of the film side of things. Before we dive into the grab bag for our week, which will dive into some more video game films on Neil's side of things. And I have a couple of very random horror games to chat about. But before we get into all that, Neil, how you doing this week?
Yeah, not too bad. Been very light on horror games, but there's plenty of adaptations to keep me cozy this week.
That's the thing, like the times of years kind of like ebb and flow in terms of the types of games that we're playing in the horror realm of things. So at least you're bringing up the rear in terms of film stuff, as of late, which has kind of inspired me at the same time to get to check out some horror film adaptations of games that I either hadn't made time for, or in some cases wasn't even aware that they were around. But, before we get into all of that, our feature of the week, probably the biggest news in the horror side of things, film-wise, and I would say probably equally game-wise, that being Zach Cregger's the director behind Weapons and Barbarian, is, at the helm of the latest crack at Resident Evil. And his take on it is very, very different seeming, just based on this even first look, right? It was like, didn't necessarily think going into the announcement he was going to be at the helm of this one, was going to follow the sort of route that the last few directors that have tried to dabble in the Resident Evil name have taken. But I think this first look I'm really excited to chat about. And apparently it's like this is supposed to be a teaser, but I feel like it was a little bit more substantial than that. So for you, like, what was your sort of gut reaction to this before we get into like a bunch of the specifics, perhaps, in terms of this first look?
Well, I'll start out by saying I'm not that much of a fan of Zach Cregger's work to date. So, like, as heathenly as that may sound to some people, I didn't think Barbarian was all that, and I really didn't like Weapons in the end, especially on a rewatch. It ended up, but I had said, I still felt that he would be a good director for a Resident Evil film because he could just have something a bit more straightforward, a bit more simple, and he could sort of go to town on doing something weird with that, like that, without necessarily going for twisty turny stuff. I suspect he's still done that with a couple of things that are in this trailer, but hey ho. Yeah, I mean, at a glance, it's like it has the core elements, I suppose, of what you might say a Resident Evil sort of story should. But like I think I said in the week, like it still has an air of, the studio exec saying, we have this franchise, you have this unrelated script that kind of sounds like it could work. Maybe they should meet in the middle, sort of thing. And lo and behold, which, happens occasionally, that things get stapled on like that. I'm not saying that it hasn't been adapted further since to make it more Resident Evil-esque, but it's typically not giving a lot away, I think, as much as it's expansive in terms of like where it is, but it's the things he's saying about when it's set, that don't quite fit with what's going on in this, which makes me think we're going to get a typical sort of Zach Cregger misdirect sort of thing. There's definitely one shot in there that looks, it could just be a torch or a flashlight, but it looks a hell of a lot like a mobile phone. And given this is set in around the time of Resident Evil 2, that's not possible. It's also supposed to be set on the outskirts of Raccoon City, where it's snowing for some reason. I'd say it's probably more in the Arklay Mountains, if that's the case. That's more likely. So it's hard to know if that's, we've heard directors say this before. Johan Roberts, who did Welcome to Raccoon City, also was on about how faithful things were. Look, we recreated the Spencer Mansion and stuff like that. But there's always underlying things like, yeah, we did this, but this is to sort of misdirect you from the things we've changed for whatever reason. Like that film had obviously Wesker not being the bad guy and not looking or sounding like Wesker, amongst other foibles that we've gone over before. So yeah, I don't know, not I I'm not hating it, let's put it that way, but I think given the director, given the history we've had with this series, where I understand the argument of it's nice to have fresh stories rather than go for just straight up adaptations when it comes to video games. But this is a franchise that, on the one time it actually did do a faithful adaptation, it still fucked it up. And every other time has been, I mean, we've had 6 or so films that aren't adaptations in the slightest, really. They are just like, they got the name, some characters in the background, and the rest of it is a vehicle for Mila Jovovich, which, yeah, fine. But it's still not Resident Evil. Yeah. And that's my only concern, I suppose, is that while it has the elements and it is trying to do a different story, I am still going to worry that it isn't going to be Resident Evil enough in the same way that certain games aren't.
Like you, I was not a fan whatsoever of weapons. That's probably my biggest disappointment of a horror film in the last few years, based on like I came to it fairly late and just like all the buzz about it. And I enjoyed Barbarians a lot when I saw it in the theaters the first time around. Enjoyed it less on a rewatch at home. Once you kind of like get through the guise of what that film is and everything, but like I still think that he's a director that has a lot of potential in terms of how he's able to tap into things. So like for him to be behind a Resident Evil film, and outside of the first 3 Resident Evil films, and that's not to give Resident Evil Apocalypse too much credit, but like that was a pivotal new metal nonsense film of my youth that I had fun with, but actually becoming somewhat of an adult has soured my feelings on that film and whatnot. But like I didn't necessarily hate the first 3. However, like post that, I have no tolerance pretty much for those films. So to, hear that he was going to be behind it, I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And especially after I watched the trailer, and then I listened to a brief interview that he gave with IGN where he talked about like, okay, I'm not really using the characters from the Resident Evil games. I am going into the film trying to capture the feeling of playing a survival horror game. I was like, okay, cool. I can be on board with that. And I found this to be a really strong trailer, actually, in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting, because of the fact that, there are some elements here that like clearly are indicative of being tied to the Resident Evil universe, but it's not tied to, we don't have to get an Umbrella logo. We don't have to hear about, the RCPD police station, those types of Easter egg type things. And those, I don't know. There's nothing else to call them, but those aren't even really Easter eggs, right? It's like, those are pretty much staples of the Resident Evil brand. But it wasn't like referential heavy. What it was referential heavy with, which is what I think speaks to maybe that Cregger's is on the right track here with capturing the feel of a survival horror game, is like the progression that teaser takes, in that, you've got our protagonist. He starts collecting various items that are indicative of like the natural progression of survival horror, which is, you start with the handgun. He's got some healing supplies. Then he goes from the handgun to the double barrel to the MP5, like that kind of a thing. Cregger says in that interview with IGN that, as you noted, takes place alongside Resident Evil 2 storyline. I'm hoping that he means more so along like the series of events rather than like proximity. Because as we noted, like clearly in the teaser. This takes place in the city during the wintertime as there's snow everywhere. And I kind of like, he set it up as saying, and I think the teaser further reinforces this, like the notion of someone that is on the outside of a major event and something is pulling them to the center of that event, which is more or less the pacing of a, survival horror game, Resi or otherwise. Like it could be, Silent Hill 2, the fact that, you're outside of Silent Hill and then you get drawn to the core of it because of the mystery box. Here,
Yeah.
Our protagonist is on the outskirts and then of the teaser, he's at a farmhouse, and then however the narrative plays out, he ends up in the city center, quite literally like in the underbelly of Raccoon City. And I think for me, and we can get into some specifics if we want, but like the single shot that makes me the most excited for this film is the shot that I'm sure gave you some pause, which is very not indicative of the traditional Resident Evil thing, which is at one point, we see this porch of a farmhouse, and there's just a overhead sort of like porch light that's illuminating the doorway that's darkened. And you start to see like limbs sprout out of it. And it's like, at first, it looks like zombies that are putting their hands outside of it and kind of like latching onto the sides of the wall. And then you see limbs that are someone's, a zombie, more or less, legs that are on the ceiling of that porch all of a sudden, like as if limbs are sprouting out of this doorway. And that single shot really gave me a lot of hope and excitement for this in a way that I wasn't anticipating, because Cregger's is not clearly afraid to give us his own vision of what is in store with the T virus. And I have some quotes from the interview that we can go into once we start to chat a little bit more about specifics that he gave with IGN again. But like this, from the outside looking in, it's clearly our very first look. This seems to be an example of a creative that's playing in a sandbox that's obviously not their own. However, is not afraid to take some liberties with that IP and those sort of like fundamentals of Resident Evil. And in my opinion, like has the wherewithal to get pretty fucking weird and disturbing with things. So I'm excited to kind of like see how he's able to play around with that. But, going from that, for you, like what were sort of like the highlights of that teaser before maybe we get into things that give us some extra pause?
Well, as much as it's a slight bone of contention, I do think the snowy setting is cool. I like a nighttime snowy setting for a survival horror style movie is fantastic. Yeah, 30 Days a Night is like a favorite of ours, in terms of doing that sort of thing. And I like that. And if it is truly going back to the 90s in terms of like aesthetic and style, like that'd be great. I think again it would just tell a certain story in a certain way. And as you said, the trajectory of that trailer does give it that survival horror flavor in terms of progression. I do wonder, like the things that stand out are, to me, as you said, these variant things, these things that you don't see or haven't really seen in games, like the creature that's multiple people, basically a porch, like the thing, the suicide bomber style zombies that jump off the roof and like that. And it kind of leads me to my theory about like the misdirect with this, which is, I think while there is an aspect to this story that is set in 1998, I think his story is not set in 1998, and he's discovering a lost umbrella town, like on the outskirts of Raccoon City. Yeah, that experiments have basically just run riot and gone and mutated and gone strange or something. That's just the way it kind of looks to it, because it's different enough. And I'd like that if that was the angle, as well. Just like to be the fact that he just kind of lands upon this town being like this, like that from, I don't know. Either way, the idea that he's just stumbled into what he thinks maybe is like an escape from what's going on in the town centre to just the stuff going on in the outskirts, because obviously we'd seen that in Resident Evil stories before, with the Spencer Mansion being like an incident before we get to the actual outbreak. That would be cool. But also, the thing that I like about this structure is it gives me hope it will be kind of more of a Resident Evil 7 style rebooting of the world in terms of like it's a shared universe, it's still the same thing, all these other things are happening around it, but it can take us on a new tangent, it can take us to a new direction, and you don't have to immediately have the connection, but you have like maybe enticing breadcrumbs that go, "Ooh, that's this and that's that." You remember like with the demo for Resident Evil 7, where towards the end of it, you get that photo of the helicopter with the umbrella logo on, like
Mm.
that, and it's like gives you that like, "Ooh, that's the first thing about this game that feels like it's connected like that." But it was an intriguing
Yeah.
hook for
Mm.
the rest of that game, and it made me excited and wondering about where this was going. So I'm kind of disappointed if it does end up being like the 90s and it
Mm.
doesn't go somewhere else with it. But yeah, it's a good way to branch out and go somewhere else with it. So those sort of different creatures and different ideas, I do like the idea of just like the exploding like zombies and
Mm.
whatever that porch thing is, and like there's the bloated sort of one that's in a sewer system by the look of it as well. And
Mm.
like I said, it does just give a hint of maybe this is something that's been sort of gestating for a while by the time he sort of turns up to it.
Yeah, I think that for me it was pretty hilarious because some of the responses to this teaser trailer were along the lines of like, it doesn't look like traditional Resident Evil. It doesn't, for all the things that we've already said, like clearly this is going in the opposite direction of what has already been given to us plenty of times at this point with a film adaptation of Resident Evil. And there's a couple of quotes that Cregger's gave during that interview that I mentioned that I think are the things that give me the most sort of like appreciation for getting a brand new look at Resident Evil. And that being that, he quite literally says that this is a film that is not, he doesn't classify it as like a zombie movie. So naturally, a lot of people were like up in arms about that. Furthermore, he says like in the teaser, there's only two or three scenes of proper, as he puts it, zombie moments.
Mm.
And one of them being that moment that you mentioned, which is like the suicidal nosediving zombies. And then there's another one where, basically our protagonist is throwing the door shut in front of a horde that's following him. Um, and again, like people were up in arms about that. And for me, like the thing that I really appreciate about that is a follow up to another quote that he had, which is he talks about, you know, only focusing on zombies, which again, we've got 30 years of, Resident Evil zombie focused media at this point.
Mm.
He finds that that's very limiting of the use of the T virus, which gets
Yeah.
into, the thing that I think is most promising in that, you see it a little bit almost with that like Baron Harkin sort of bloater that we see in this, the sewer in the teaser, but also the doorway zombie that I mentioned, which like, this is totally speculation on my part. I think that it's going to be akin to something like the Rat King from The Last of Us Part 2, in that there's some kind of mutated hodgepodge of corpses that's unlike anything we've seen in the Resident Evil series. And I think that first sort of look at it in that scene is an indication that like he's going to get really weird and really creative with the T virus. And he even talks about like something that's pursuing the protagonist throughout the film that continually is pushing him to the center of Raccoon City, other than whatever his initial sort of like drive to being in that general vicinity is. And so I think for me, like that's the thing that is most exciting is that he's already shown in this brief teaser, like he's not afraid to go off script, as it were. And I think that that's going to ultimately not be a huge deal once that we actually get to see the film, because of the fact that the movie is going to feel hopefully like the progression of the survival horror genre that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
For me, like, again, like you had kind of said, we've had so many of these films that already have given us a more or less traditional Resident Evil experience that I want something that barely feels like Resident Evil, but has some of the same, I suppose, some of the familiar variables, but again, goes like completely off script.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this ourselves, in terms of like certain movies, like getting, or in fact, actually, when we were talking about Alien, like games, we're saying how the ones that sort of evoke like the Dark Horse comics and do all the weird stuff in those, it's kind of cool that that happened. And certainly in the movies, and like Predator as well has gone down that route of like taking like the graphic novels and book sort of ideas of something slightly outside the norm. And Resident Evil has a history where you had the novelizations of the original stories by S.D. Perry, which also had these standalone stories, that did feature characters from like the games, but they were like things that didn't appear in the games. They would go on different missions and find different things that Umbrella had done. And yeah, there's a lot of scope for that, especially if you are going to invoke sort of peak Umbrella years of like, they got all the money, they're doing all the weird things. It's like it would make sense that there'd be somewhere else they were doing some secret nefarious nonsense. And given like Requiem's kind of given us an idea that that was happening anyway, as well, that is great. Yeah, so I think could be a smart way to go about it if it does do that. And yeah, I mean, it's the great thing about it, I guess, is we don't have to wait long to find out. September is when this is coming out, which seems remarkably soon, considering Weapons was like a year ago by that point. And yeah, so he's moved quick with that. Also just could see Austin Abrams, who was one of the better things of Weapons as well, in the lead role here. He was a series regular on The Walking Dead for a while as well, so well housed in doing stuff like that. I think Paul Walter Hauser is in this too. I think it's got, like I said, given that film, I think it's got the right kind of guy for this situation and thing like that. So yeah, I guess we'll see when it does come out, but it's difficult to know exactly where we're going to go with it, I guess. It's just, which the best thing I can say is that it's good for speculation at this point.
Well, all I can say is that I was already sold on just this teaser, so I won't be watching anything else until it comes out. And I completely missed the bouncing ball of this being out in September. So just based on this initial teaser trailer, that's great news for me at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, shocker. That means we'll probably be covering Resident Evil again at some point
Oh,
in the future.
Imagine that.
That was probably going to happen anyway this year again,
Yeah.
but that's definitely going to happen now because of that.
Well, we'll find another angle to tackle that franchise with, in addition to the new film coming out. But we'll wait for that to actually be out before we delve too much into that.
Yes, and probably look at some of the older ones as well and see about that. But yeah, we should.
All right. Well, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into our respective grab bags for the week. And we are back from our break. And Neil, do you want to kick us off with your first film video game adaptation of the week?
Oh, yes. What shall I choose? This would be interesting. But seeing as a child not far off, maybe I won't pick the one that's certainly more controversial. Galarian's Rion. Rion is a 2002 sort of adaptation of the PS1 sort of survival horror video game, which is basically about like an amnesiac boy who's got like strange telekinetic powers, kind of Akira, kind of like Carrie sort of stuff. In this version of it, it's, again, he awakes imprisoned in this hospital, no name, no memory, and he's attacked the second he sort of awakens, and then that's when he finds out he had these powers. And then he has this voice in his head calling him to help this person in his head, and sending him on this little sort of adventure, basically, to save her. Now, the things to mention about this one, it's the most 2002 film ever, the version I saw, because it was repackaged for Western audiences with a proper new metal soundtrack. So you can expect exactly the sort of thing. Name a band from that era that gives you those sort of industrial, grungy sort of new metal vibes. They're there. So you have your Fear Factories and your Slipknot and stuff like that. The visuals of it are pretty much like improved cutscenes sort of visuals, like a PS2 sort of style
Mm.
thing, which I was going into thinking, that doesn't sound like that would be that appealing. But two things about this. It's got this sort of cyber sort of body horror thing going on, which works visually quite well. Yes, certainly the backgrounds, because it has a very survival horror feel to it. They're really well done. Both the characters all kind of look like Chucky dolls, in terms of like their aesthetic. Like they have those sort of heads, those sort of eyes, the eyeliner on them for some reason. And yeah, there's just lots of shouty dialogue, and basically the story is just, who am I? Where am I? Find someone else with powers turns up. They have a fight. It's like a boss fight, and then the next one comes along. It just goes through like that. It's a very basic story, and it does pretty much play out like a video game. In theory, it should be terrible because everything I said. New metal soundtrack. It's literally looks like a PS2 game. But I don't know. It was entertaining, like because it sticks to its guns so well in terms of like having that aesthetic and that sort of really smart choice for like having that sort of soundscape for it, like that. Just it really did just feel like a portal back to 2002 for something that I hadn't played at the time or anything like that, and it's not exactly the same. Yeah, no, it was a nice surprise because I just did not expect anything more from it than that, than especially those first 5 minutes, seeing it looking like that and going, it's just gonna be like watching like a all cutscenes video on YouTube sort of thing. But they sort of fill in the gaps nicely, even if it is very simple. And the boss characters, if you will, are all quite interesting in terms of like they all share similar sort of telekinetic powers, but they have little quirks that make them unique. And it follows the very typical sort of anime thing of like, oh, new power comes up against mine. Oh, now I've discovered a new thing I can do, sort of thing. And it goes on and on like that. And the obstacles sort of push up. Yeah, it was a nice surprise. Like, as far as adaptations go, it's weirdly, well, not necessarily faithful. It's faithful in tone. Even though its tone is completely different to the original game because of this version I watched.
Well, add this to the category of like just bizarre survival horror games that I didn't even know existed before you mentioned them. But I think that I said to you last week off air, but it was like when you're starting to tell me some of the movies that you had that you were planning to tackle for both podcasts and just your general endeavor of delving into the very best and a lot of the worst, it seems, of video game film
Spoiler, they're
adaptations.
mostly the worst.
Yeah. This was one that I think kind of like gave me pause, made me say to you, like, I guess all you can hope for at the very best for most of these is like, hopefully it's entertaining to some degree. Cause I don't know if the word good is going to get thrown around a whole lot, but, yeah.
Yeah, I think you very much have to take all these films on their own terms in so many ways. And
Mm.
yeah, I think it's just because this happens to be a very particular kind of package. Yeah, what I got from it, people were born maybe like 10 years, 15 years later,
Mm.
look at it and go, what? You very much have to have lived through the new metal era of
Mm.
media to sort of feel at home, I guess, for this, which I think is represented in like on Letterboxd's rating is like 3.4, which for a video game adaptation is surprisingly high. Albeit, I think only like 750 odd people have seen it at this point, but on there.
I guess my next question is like, how far removed is this from something like Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within?
like completely the opposite way because it is, inherently like a video game as well, like
Mm,
that, and the themes of it are all there,
mm.
and everything is, visually it's definitely uglier than that Final Fantasy movie, but obviously it's more like a video game in that
Mm.
style, so it's more endearing. Like it doesn't feel like that sort of weird dead-eyed oddness. Like it's funny that all the characters look like Chucky with different wigs on, but it's also it's endearing.
At the very least, for me, I haven't seen it clearly, but the most disappointing aspect of this is that it made me want to look into the original game for PlayStation, and yet naturally, it's not available outside of exorbitant secondhand markets for the physical
Mm.
game. So I guess I won't be getting to the bottom of that one anytime soon. But at least in the interim, I know to avoid the film.
Don't have to involve. Yeah, it's fine. No, you're gonna have to watch it anyway because I'm gonna make sure you watch all these
Oh
films. So,
fuck!
if I must suffer, you must suffer. That's the way we do.
Dress. I'll have you Venmo me for the beer that's going to be required for me to make it through
Okay.
these. I guess at the very
In
least.
in fairness, this one's only 73 minutes as well. So,
Oh well,
yeah.
I guess there is a silver lining there at the end of the day.
Yeah, and to be fair, if you get wasted enough, yeah, it will feel like you're in an early 2000s party with all the music in it. So
I was around then. I remember the sort of early aughts trash that we got then. So I'll have a frame of reference. There we go.
there you go. There you go.
Uh, um, but I guess moving on from that, I'll get right into the first thing that I had for my grab bag this week, which is taking us
Mm,
in the opposite direction. That being a puzzle horror game that is actually a series that's celebrating its 11 years of murderous puzzles. That being the Rusty Lake series, and that being the developer's name as well. You know, a developer that's behind also a series that's called Cube Escape. So the Rusty Lake series, as I said, is a series of puzzle games, and I think that they're notable or at least recognizable by this central theme that they all share, which is their art style. And that art style I think is described as being called art nouveau, which is like the new art movement that is
mm,
essentially around the Victorian era. And for layman's like myself, until I actually had to Google what the hell type of art style this was. This art style I would describe as being like Victorian fantasy art, in that all of the characters' heads have been replaced with that of animals. So that
mm.
kind of like gives you sort of a primer, I suppose, for the approach that the Rusty Lake world takes throughout all of its games. Um, and, in the case of Rusty Lake Hotel, the player is essentially invited to this hotel that is located on an island. It just so happens it's the only landmark on that island. And there's 5 guests that are there. And essentially, what that 60 to 90 minutes of gameplay entails is solving a series of puzzles that ultimately leads to each of the guests' demise. So from the outset, I led with the art style, and I'll say that, like, from a visual standpoint, the illustrations that this game uses, I think, and I don't know if you have much experience with this series, but I'm sure you've looked it up on Steam. Like, these games are gorgeous to look at, I think.
Mm.
I would almost say that they are akin somewhat to like Wes Anderson films.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think like they have the same level of zaniness to them that his films do, but at the same time, like it feels like an extension almost of like Isles of Dogs or something, just in terms of the sort of like animal centric nature of protagonists, but also I think just the overall like art style and the aesthetic of the art of the environments that you're exploring.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Mm,
to me, it's like if Wes Anderson did like a mid 2000s like web animation sort of thing.
yeah.
Like
Mm,
it's just got that sort of surrealness in terms of like the animal-headed people and weird shit like that. But as you said, very much stylized in a way that's a bit more prim and proper.
sure. No, I think that's a perfect way to describe it because a big draw for me was the art style initially. I'm not, as I've said in the past, I'm not a huge fan of puzzle games, and I don't necessarily know that like the puzzles are the highlight of the experience for me. But in terms of like a world and meeting various inhabitants of a world that are equally as weird as the world they occupy, like I was really taken with Rusty Lake Hotel to the degree that I wanted to check out some of their other games. Which at this point I think there's three, two other entries in the Rusty Lake series, and again, like not all of the developer Rusty Lake's games are of the same horror variety, but they do take on the same sort of like puzzle variety. So there's not only Rusty Lake Hotel, there's Rusty Lake Roots, Rusty Lake Paradise, which I want to check out at a certain point. But yeah, I was really quite taken with the overall setup for this game, a puzzle game which has a bit more of a narrative thing to it. Each one of the guests you have to kill at the end of each puzzle have a personality behind them. The means with which you have to murder them is tied to that. Like one of them is very much tied to like their vanity. So you have to take their photo and then devise a way to murder them. One of them, I believe, is an addict. So their addiction, it has to be exploited to take them out. And for each one of their personalities, there's like a specific reason for them to be at this hotel. It's not just like happenstance. It's like, no, they've been lured there essentially. So for the addict, the hotel has been advertised to them as being like the number one sort of like rehabilitation center type of a thing, which overall just like gives the game this almost like Hitman insidious feel to it of, the means with which you take them out. And yeah, I guess, what's kind of like your impression of this? You familiar with the Rusty Lake series? If so, have you played them at all? If not, is there anything about this series from the outset that kind of like stands out to you as being notable?
Yeah, I hadn't played those games, but I had reviewed a later game that this company is called The Past Within, I
Mm.
think, which is a
Mhm.
puzzle, like a puzzler for two, as they put it. Where it's basically like an online co-op thing, where very niche sort of way of doing it, like that,
Mhm.
where basically you're trusting part of the puzzling to someone else on the other side of it and trying to communicate certain aspects of it. It's like it's very difficult to describe, like in terms of how it goes, but it's like it was a really smart idea, and like I said, the unfortunate thing is it does rely on you having someone who is actually you're going to talk to and
Yeah.
communicate with while you play it, because you cannot play it with a stranger at all with that thing. But it was really smart puzzling and like very unique setup in terms of how that went. So I knew that much about them, in terms of that. But yeah, like as you said, I looked at these games, when you brought this up for this episode, and yeah, I like, it goes back to that sort of point and click sort of thing that we've been so enamored with in recent years. And yeah, that aesthetic does make it stand out. And given that was what they said 10 years ago that these
Mm.
games started coming out as well. Yeah, well, I don't really have any experience, unfortunately, with those ones, which is the only sort of. But looking at it now, and having played stuff from them before, yeah, I'd be quite happy to sort of come back to this one.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning too. Like I've got this when it was on sale for the anniversary. It was like $1.
Yeah,
Outside of that, it's a $2 game.
yeah,
So, while I found that thematically, I really appreciated the puzzles because of the fact that, again, like it ties into the personality behind each of the, targets, if you will.
mm,
Um, there are some of them that are quite um, vague or obtuse. There's a couple, whether it's overall or whether it is like a specific component, you basically go into each of the victims' rooms and then you through searching left and right, you go through like 4 rooms within their overall room or 4 perspectives of a room,
mm,
and whatnot. And like there are some aspects of the puzzles that I think I know I had to use a guide for because I was just like, oh, this is not really intuitive at all, or the specific sort of like ramifications or things like that were just like too vague. There's no way I would have gotten them if I hadn't done that, which
yeah,
is, you know, again, I'm not going to take to task a series that's a decade plus as old as this is for that. Um, because of the fact that overall, like, I just really enjoyed my time with this game and the art style and that world and whatnot. But even if you have to use a guide, which I would surmise some people will, it's the thing where it's like I still enjoyed my 2 hours I spent with this game. Again, it was it's a $2 game, so it's not exactly a high point of entry in terms of cost, but its art style really captivated me, and I enjoyed it a great deal. And if anything, it made me want to check out some of their other games, and some of their other games are free. They're not Rusty Lake
Yeah.
games, but they do have a couple of other like weird, kind of like surreal puzzle games that I want to check out now. So I think for those reasons and a few more, like overall production value and some of the dark humor that's there, it's well worth checking out. So I was glad that sale kind of like piqued my interest because it introduced me to a whole new developer that is developing for a subgenre that I really, really love and have grown a great deal of appreciation for over the last few years.
Yeah.
But what was the other film adaptation of video games that you had for us this week?
Well, eventually, I was going to have to get to a Uwe Boll film, and to be fair, I may have started on the higher end with these, so that's something. And that was his 2007 adaptation of Postal.
Hmm.
Um, it's in terms of being a faithful video game adaptation,
Hmm.
tonally, again, this is like probably one of the most accurate. It's aimless. Lots of weird shit happens that's crude. It doesn't really linger on it. It just happens. The story is not much to write home about. And, it just finds things to poke fun at and in interesting ways. And occasionally that's funny. Yeah, and that's the great thing about it. So as a result, it's just like the Postal games, which unfortunately is a downside because in being faithful to the Postal games, you can only go so far because, they are fun distractions for a very short time, but nothing much more, I would say. I was saying at the time, there's terrible sort of crude comedies, that have like one common weakness, which is that they really do linger on their jokes and the disgusting stuff they're doing, like to the point where it's kind of dulled by this, by a sort of trudging repetition. I do think here, and what much with the game, Your Bowl has kind of made a different kind of terrible crude comedy because it literally just does not linger too long on any of these jokes. It may come back to them occasionally and like repeat them ad nauseum, but it still has the decency to sort of break it into these bite-sized pieces. And I do think that helps sort of save this from being like another horrendous Your Bowl game adaptation. Yes, it's in shockingly bad taste, of course, because that's the point. I don't know, considering some of the films that I've watched in recent years that have been going for the extreme sort of thing and like going over the top, it's so stupid and so like laissez-faire about what it does that it doesn't feel that offensive a lot of the time, and it makes it funnier. They recreate the whole using a cat as a silencer thing from the game, for instance, and it's like the context of that scene is done really well because like he literally distracts the guy he's about to shoot by going meow and then shooting with a cat gun, like little things like that. So it ends up being like this surprisingly watchable film, like in terms of like it's actually occasionally quite funny. It's definitely trying too hard. There's no doubt about that. Dave Foley's in it. It's quite enjoyable. Zach Ward is the Postal dude, and who he voices the Postal dude in a lot of the games as well. And he does quite well as being like this very put upon, like going postal type. Even though if you could say one thing that doesn't really fit the description, it's like he doesn't really go gun crazy murderous. He's more framed as a accidental hero sort of thing, framed for doing terrible things. Vern Troyer shows up in it for a bit and gets raped by 100 monkeys, which they don't really show, but they imply enough about that. J.K. Simmons is inexplicably in it for a bit, and he gets exploded into jam. But it's Yeah, and even Uebol turns up and has a fight with the creator of Postal about doing a bad adaptation of his game. Uebol then gets shot in the nuts as well, for good
Oh
measure.
no.
No, no, yes. He also says some things that are you know, fine in terms of comedy, sure, but it's like you wonder if maybe that's a bit too risque for someone
Hmm.
who's got not exactly a well-renowned person. But yeah, I mean, I didn't hate it, so that was something. I kind of dreaded going into this, but yeah, this does seem like it will be like the high point in terms of like his films. I know there's a lot of like ironic like 5-star ratings on Letterboxd for this one, but yeah, some of it isn't ironic. I think there is something you could say about it being faithful. But
Hmm.
when we were talking about Resident Evil and yeah, the idea of doing faithful adaptations, that's fine. But the source material can only take you so far, and when your source material doesn't really have a proper story, and yeah, it's like what else can you do about it? Yeah, so it's not much else you can really say about it. It's just like a non-story sort of thing that has some occasionally funny moments in it.
Yeah, somebody that doesn't have any experience with the Postal series and just knows about it through reputation. Like I do, however, remember when the adaptation for this was being released, and it just being like at the time the final nail in Uwe Boll's sort of like coffin in terms of respectability. But then again, jokes on me, I suppose, because he's been making films still ever since. But I think that your sort of like description of it perfectly lines up with, again, my like sort of just overall knowledge, I suppose, of that series
Mm.
since then and even post, because of the fact that like even though I think in the last 5 years there's been at least one Postal game that was like developed and received well, but also like developed by people that clearly understood the farce and the ludicrous nature of that series and like leaned into it in a way that was more self-aware. And I think it was even received like somewhat decently, which is not saying a great deal given that series sort of reputation and pedigree. But at the end of the day, like a film adaptation of this, if it was anything but over the top, totally compared, considering like what year was this movie again?
2007. Yeah.
Yeah, and they even managed like to sneak in a 9/11 joke in there, which I distinctly remember from the screenshots that I
Oh
saw
yeah.
of this. It's just like,
Yeah. The opening joke is basically like them, like the terrorists flying the
mhm.
plane into the tower, having a debate about how many virgins they were promised, and then getting on the phone to Osama bin Laden to find out that they can only guarantee as many as like 8 or something. Like it's just it's like, which is amusing in terms of that. Like, and the punchline of it being yes, that plane, I guess, as well. But which I suppose was slightly more surprising just given the distance, but yeah, shouldn't have been, I guess. I'll say this: I had more fun with it than I did with the last Postal game I played, which I think was Postal 4, which I think I reviewed back in 2023, and I think I gave that, I gave it 2.5 out of 10. So.
Well, there you go. And I'm looking it up now. I guess the only Postal game that's been received with any real praise was Postal Brain Damaged, which it looks like was at least published by the Running with Scissors guy, though it wasn't developed by them. But however,
Mm.
that kind of just goes again to show you this sort of like history and lineage of Postal. But yeah, to hear that Uwe Boll was at the helm again of a film adaptation of that is no surprise to me. But haven't been exactly sold on checking that one out. So maybe I'll just watch clips of it on YouTube Shorts or something.
Yeah, I mean, best film he's done other than I think Rampage, which
Mm,
was still like okay, and that again, whilst not a video game film, felt quite video gamey in terms of, and ironically had weirdly both films star someone who was in Freddy versus Jason, so
yeah.
the kid actually the kid who played Zach Ward's brother in that film was the lead in that film. So yeah, very odd sort of thing, and weirdly a few years after that. Yeah, I think I've only seen 3 because I've seen his House of the Dead film, and
Mm.
not that I remember. I'm gonna have to revisit it because I don't remember it. God help me. And obviously there's the Alone in the Dark, and the Blood Rains, and the Far Cry, and the Name of the King, and oh, goodness, there's a few.
God, I'm gonna be ever so selective when I get around to watching some of these recommendations of yours.
Recommendations.
Oh yeah, that should have been in big quotes. That's my fault.
List of demands.
A much more accurate way to put that.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
Oh,
Oh,
dear.
but yeah, I can round us out now with my last sort of pick for the grab bag this week. And it's a very random one in the grand scheme of things, but for me, it's more of like a nostalgia pick, and that being a Marathon 2 Randall, which is the second entry in the Marathon series. For those that don't know, this was Bungie Software's first person shooter franchise that I believe originally debuted on the Macintosh before they ever got around to developing games for PC. And obviously, since it's from the 90s, very much a precursor to Halo. But this was a game that I distinctly remember from my childhood because, one of the rare times my dad was not into me playing video games at all, but he would have friends that were into PC games from work. And, inevitably they'd have a spare demo disc or two from their subscriptions to PC Gamer or whatever, Macworld magazines and stuff like that. And so those would inevitably get sent home with my dad and he'd give them to me. Though I could only play them on the weekend for about 30 minutes at a time, which was, anyways, I'll spare any sort of child abuse jokes, as that's not a funny topic. But as someone that was in love with video games from the sight of them being deprived of that for a long while, anyways, I haven't had a tangent like that in a while. Anyways, this was a game that again was on one of those demo discs, and I think it had like the first 3 levels or whatever, and after that, I would only be playing like Blizzard games on PC for the next like 5 years. Blizzard, StarCraft, and Warcraft, and Backyard Baseball. I had a really random PC gaming childhood. But then this was a game that, like, still in the back of my mind, I was always like, I wonder what the rest of that game looked like, which was always indicative of like the best demos that were on those demo discs, because it did just enough to like pique your interest and we're just titillating enough that you're like, oh, I want to check this out more. And so, I would, of course, go on to play like Halo and became a huge fan of first person shooters, but the Marathon series didn't have the same readily availability that some of those other games did. And, now within the last 5 years, the original core trilogy of the Marathon games, Marathon 2, Marathon, I think it's Infinity, the third entry, are all free on Steam. So I picked all these up, as everybody should, with the price of being free. And, I wanted to delve into it just for nostalgia's sake. I was like, fuck it. Like, well, I don't have anything to lose. I'll spend 30 minutes playing this. I'll get my fix and then never go back to it. And over the last 2 weeks, I probably, in between everything else, probably spent about 6 hours playing this, which was far more time than I anticipated spending with it, because I don't know if this is your experience, but like a lot of times when I go back and I try to play games that are earlier than 2000s or even like early aughts games from my childhood, a lot of times, like, it's the type of thing people talk about them with the rose tinted glasses, right? It's like, oh, my nostalgia is speaking louder than actually any discussion for this still being viable to enjoy in contemporary times. And I found, for the most part, though it's not without its faults, like Marathon 2 still holds up in a way that I was completely unprepared for. In terms of a narrative, it's more or less like Halo. It's just this notion of like, in the far future, there's alien races. The humans are in, constant conflict and struggle with them. Humans venture out to try to sabotage their various civilizations and settings and things. And you're fighting on space stations and alien planets. Like, it's more or less sci-fi paperback jargon, if you will. But what I will say is, as someone that's a massive fan of the Doom games, and the Doom games came out prior to these, I believe.
Yes,
Marathon
yeah.
2, yeah.
Yeah, it was 94 for the first one.
hmm The first one was 94. Marathon 2 came out the following year. But you can really tell that Bungie learned a lot from the craze of, Doom and some of the other id Software first person shooters, because this is still a really, really impressive game from a just structural standpoint. Now, granted,
Mm.
the version that most people are playing include like the HD graphics pack that came with the Xbox Live version.
Yeah.
However, like, I'm not even talking about it from the point of like just the graphics. I'm talking about in terms of like the lighting in these games is really, really impressive to a degree that, as someone that does not really like care all that much about graphics, if I'm being honest, like, the lighting work here is so impressive. You walk into some environments and they're pitch black, and you throw on a light switch and you have these like flickering lights, and just the ways in which that really adds to the sort of moodiness of the architecture of a lot of these levels, does a lot to further like differentiate it from Doom, which, I mean,
Mm.
you're talking about any 90s first person shooter. It doesn't matter if it's horror adjacent or otherwise. Doom is going to be in that conversation as an influence. And here, like, not to say Marathon isn't influenced by it, but um, it there's like a real differentiating in terms of I suppose, the scale of environments, the technical ability to include things such as lighting, but also the like the verticality of environments, even that we would see naturally. This month is the 10th anniversary of the Doom reboot that id would do in, I believe, 2016, and even going back to Marathon, like, there's a verticality to levels was not that was like on par, if not superseded, I think, Doom in a lot of ways. Um, and on top of that, like, I don't particularly care for the lore that's here, but like, the one thing that I think this game really has a leg up on in terms of Doom is that it goes out of its way to include lore that's more
Mm.
overt than Doom. Like, Doom was never really concerned with that, but like the depth of lore, every single level, you come across three or four different like computer terminals, and there's like paragraphs of lore in terms of establishing the setting, the various players in it, and also like giving context to the levels that you're currently in, which, it's, and like, airport novel, paperback, sci-fi fiction type shit. It's not going to blow you away, but taking it back to like the mid 90s, rather than just being another like aimless shooter that's getting by on personality like Duke Nukem 3D or something, I was really appreciative of that in a way that I think Marathon, maybe amongst fans, does, but amongst the general gaming population, like, doesn't get the same type of love that maybe it deserves in terms of like going the extra mile and establishing this more than just shoot everything that moves kind of a thing. Do
Mm.
you have any sort of experience with the Marathon series?
With Marathon 2, I did.
Hmm.
Yeah, originally, like, quite amusing. I never remembered who'd made it. So when Halo was a thing and I didn't like Halo, I didn't actually know that that was the same developer. Um, but yeah, no, I just remembered so vividly that the color scheme of it was just so bright and gaudy in a evocative way. It
Hmm.
really did work well for me in that regard. Um, again, I think it's one of those ones I played like a demo version of or something similar like that at the time. So I never got to play the whole game.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's like, but that was the case with so many games. Like, that's pretty much the story of most of my PC gaming at that time. Was like, it usually started with a shareware version or a demo version of some kind of
Hmm.
these things. And yeah, it's like it's one of those things that kind of escaped my memory until they brought it back. What was it, a couple of years ago, I think, with
Hmm.
these versions. Like,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh yeah, I played this. I remember this sort of thing like that. And specifically it being Marathon 2 because of that color scheme and that HUD layout and stuff. But yeah, it's like obviously not stood in my memory long enough to be a cherished favorite like some others, but I think at the time I liked it because it was the thing that kind of, when I played it anyway by then, was like the thing that reminded most of Duke Nukem in terms of like structure, in terms of like
Mm.
it not being like the classic Doom style thing. And yeah, again, it's one of the, if I'd played it earlier, would I have been more blown away by it? Because I had played Duke Nukem and Quake by the time I got around to playing Marathon 2. So
Mm.
yeah, but yeah, it's fascinating to see that. I don't suppose you played the recent version Bungie have done.
I have not, but in revisiting, the trilogy, the original trilogy, it's made me consider it. Have you spent time with it?
No, no, and I'm tempted because it's an extraction shooter style
Mm.
game now as well, and it's got a lot of the color scheme thing going on, and
Hmm.
within video game critic circles, that there are people who are like really into it in terms of what it's doing. I think people say it's more akin to what stuff like Hunt Showdown than Arc Raiders in terms of
Mm.
its structure, a nichey sort of thing, which is tempting. I think right now it's on sale, but yeah, like yeah, it's do I have time for another online game basically at this
Right.
point? But even if it does look sort of intriguing, the other thing being like I've been burned by Bungie games before and not liked them, like the Destiny games. I think it's during the PS4 era, but like yeah, people wanted me desperately to get it because we were to play together, and I just did not get on with it at all. So so there is that side of thing where you just worry. But yeah, given that they put out a reasonable price point, I might, yeah, do that. And
Mm.
who knows? But yeah, I do like that in the new version they've given a very bright color scheme, and I think got some of the same ideas. And again, the way you were describing like the air quotes storytelling sort of thing
Mm.
of it, it being there in the background. So it's the same thing from the sounds of it with the new version, where like there's a lot of stuff in the background, which to be fair, Bungie did really well with Destiny and Destiny 2. There was lots of like background lore and story details and stuff like that. It's just, but I just didn't like the game itself enough to
Yeah.
really care about it as much as I should. But it's probably the only reason I kept coming back to try and try again.
Well, that's the thing. Like for me, I'm not going to go ahead and say like again, the original trilogy is free on Steam right now, so there's
Yeah.
no reason that if people are at least passingly interested in it, they shouldn't check it out. However, like I'm not going to say that if you go back and play these, that they're going to give you like a newfound appreciation for the genre. But I think that again, when you talk about the history of first-person shooters from this era, like
Mm.
Marathon definitely deserves to be in that conversation. Um, to I don't know, same degree sounds like an oversell, but like it
Mm.
deserves to be at least mentioned alongside Doom in a way that I don't think that it actually is, as it should be, because of the fact that again, like it has a lot of technical features and even narrative features that I think are rival or supersede Doom
Mm.
classics in some ways that again do make it noteworthy. I'll say more than noteworthy. But yeah, if anything, like you had said, personally, I'm not a huge multiplayer gamer anymore these days, just because of the time commitment. But when it comes to extraction shooters, those are probably the only types of shooters I'm interested in. And from what I've seen of the latest reboot of Marathon, like that is the sort of like biggest impulse buy that I've had, or game that's kind of like begging me to buy it because of that.
Yeah.
I can feel that itch getting scratched by that in a way that I love that sort of like art style that it has. That sort of like what was it? Um, Mirror's Edge kind of like
Yeah.
Neo Tokyo Akira esque kind of like style to it that I just would love to delve into, and especially for an extraction shooter with some of the wild weaponry there, because that's another aspect I suppose of Marathon original games, like the guns. If you've played Halo, they're more or less an extension of that, but at the same time, like the art style sells that stuff in a way, and the enemies that you're fighting are just like really really cool. So fuck, I think I just talked myself into re-upping my Xbox Live Gold subscription because I definitely want to check that out as amongst some other shooters and stuff like that. But Yeah, I just had a lot of fun with that. And again, it's fucking free. So if you've had any interest in 90s era first person shooters, I would probably skip the original Marathon, if I'm being honest. And from what I played in Marathon Infinite, it almost overcomplicates the aspects of design that make Marathon 2 such a standout for me. So I think Marathon 2 is really the sweet spot. And clearly, Bungie learned a lot in making that trilogy that would go into Halo, which I'm notably a bigger fan of that series than you are. But I think ultimately they learned a lot of hard lessons with Marathon that ended up with making Halo one of the most influential, not necessarily best, but influential first person shooters of all time.
Yeah, and I will say, I think what I like about marathon games is that fact that they use their colorfulness in a way that I think Halo didn't use as well. I think it's just because Halo comes across more gaudy in that regard, but it does have flickers of moments where it evokes that sort of style of marathon in terms of it's like whether it's stuff like the Needler and things like and certain enemy types where you just go, oh yeah, that's that stuff straight away. Again, that was like in hindsight, like after realizing that, it was the same developers and stuff. But yeah, like Bungie have always been there trying different things with the medium. Which is like, while I may not have got on with what they've done every time, is great that there's someone out there doing that. I do kind of wish they'd maybe like stop getting in bed with like console makers and finding out that it just leads them to ruin. So, like that's happened so far.
Could have learned some lessons there within, I suppose.
Yeah, if Halo didn't teach them, Destiny should have at least. But nice to see they're having pretty decent, modest success with the new Marathon as well, and it's got its own cult following, which I think is really hard to do these days. So that's I think people were expecting something bigger because it's Bungie, obviously, but I do believe it was never meant to be like this massive mega blockbuster thing, and it's just like because it was Sony backing it, there were people wanting it to be either like the second coming of Christ or the biggest failure ever, depending on what camp they sat in.
No, absolutely. Like I think at the end of the day, that's the thing that I really was not that I suppose at the time I was not looking forward to the reboot of Marathon. However, like I will say, my hope for that through and through was always let them just like have the freedom to get weird with it and see what comes out the other end. Right. I think that that's the best sort of like course of action that games such as that can take. In that it's like, if you're going to reboot something, please do not spend all this money and time on something that's exactly identical to what came out 20, 30 years ago. Spend some time like having some of that visual identity transition over, but at the same time, like just fucking get weird with it. Just be experimental, try something new, give it your own spin on it and see what comes out the other end. And more or less, it seems like from the general perception that I've seen of the Marathon reboot, like they kind of achieve that. Going the extraction shooter route is like completely out of left field compared to where that series origins were. Obviously, extraction shooters weren't a thing at that time, but yeah, that's what made me really want to check it out, because to not take some kind of weird new route with that franchise, it's like, cool, you guys are making another Destiny, you're making another type of Halo type game, but no, they like spun out their own sort of interpretation of what that franchise was about. And it seems like they're sort of reaping the benefits of it, even if the audience maybe is not as big as whatever its competitors of COD and Battlefield and these types of things are.
Yeah, they're carving a niche of their own, which is the important thing.
But yeah, unless you had anything else, I think that's going to do it for this week's episode of Safe Room, and diving into another episode of, grab bag that taps into the game side of things, the film side of things. And as has been the case, we can say that next week's episode will be of a similar type. That being, we're going to delve into the Mortal Kombat series, what with, a new film adaptation on the horizon. We're going to delve into the films of the series that we've seen, and of course, the games as well. And as we both know, and everybody knows, Mortal Kombat has always had one foot firmly planted in horror, so we'll get to dive into that and much more in terms of what makes that such a seminal series and whatnot. But until then, my friend, as always, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's main feed episode of Safe Room. If you've enjoyed our horrifying discussions, please take a moment to rate and review the show on your preferred podcast platform, as this helps us immensely in ensuring that the show continues to grow. For any and all show updates and additional content, you can follow Safe Room on all of our socials, which are linked in the episode notes, at Safe Room Pod. And finally, you can send any and all emails to saferoompod@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.